Hello, BookTube. I wanted to give you a quick weekend update of a kind of my weekend reading. A really good weekend of reading. I got a potted plant. I got a potted lavender plant named Larry, who is now sitting on my Target shelf. I can't help but notice that he's not dead yet, even though he's been here for 24 hours, and also that there's lots more room. Lots more room. I could put 4 or 5 more plants on that shelf, which gets, under normal circumstances, bright sunlight and fresh breezes all day long. Doesn't get them first thing in the morning, doesn't get them at sunset, but all day long, the sun is just hitting that spot. I think it's perfect for a certain kind of plant. We will see. We will see if Larry thrives here. The little card inside the plant says that it needs just a basic general all-purpose fertilizer. I don't have anything like that, so I'm going to have to go to the garden center at the hardware store and see if the slack-jawed, completely affectless teenager with the ring through his lip actually knows anything about the job that he's holding. But apart from Larry, Larry was the high point. But I did a lot of reading this weekend, and I wanted to take you through it, talk about it a little. The first thing I read was this, and I could not resist. This is not coming out until the end of summer, but I could not resist. This is Paul Murray's book, The Bee Sting, which we saw on this channel. It's a great big galley. Does this tell me how many pages? Almost 700 pages to this thing, and I really, really liked it. I really, really did. I will very much want to read this again. But this is, the bee sting of the title is one item that takes place that early on in the book that seems to shard off its own string of consequences, much like the novel The Slap. But this is really a big, gigantic book about contingencies, about whether or not things ever really happen. And if they do really happen, do they kind of sort of really happen over a long period of time, no matter what it looks like? And you might think that would lead to nihilism, that would make this a very nihilistic novel. And I was expecting that all the way through the book, but even when the novel explicitly talks in nihilistic terms, I didn't get that feeling at all. There's a passage late in the book. Here's a fact about the universe, maybe the number one fact. It's impossible to comprehend how much it doesn't care about us. It's not just that it doesn't care about life, that's with a capital L. It doesn't even care about matter. Everything we think of as everything, starlight, marshmallows, frogs, basketball, electricity, every single person who ever lived and died, all the stuff there is and all the energy, that's only a minuscule fraction of the universe. The rest of it is darkness. Dark energy, dark matter, which are just words scientists use for we don't know what this is. What we call the universe is basically a microscopic speck on this giant, incomprehensible darkness, like a piece of lint on a 10XL size sweater, and life is like a nano-sized speck on that speck. So when you think about it, who cares about saving it or anything in it? Because basically none of it was ever supposed to be there. That's at the end of the book, and those sentiments are struck all throughout. So you would think that this would be a hopeless kind of thing. I can't help but notice also that, it's full of postmodern narrative gimmicks. There are no quotations around dialogue. Is the number one gimmick. But also, it's told in the second person. So, you go to the lecture hall, well, you don't like this professor very much, that sort of thing. The most famous example of which, at least from a bygone era, I don't know how old Paul Murray is. I get the feeling that he's kind of young. But the most famous example in a previous literary generation was Bright Light's Big City. I don't like it as a narrative genre. I've tried it myself, and I don't like it when it's done this way and when it's done in Bright Light's Big City. Because the number one question that posing your point of view narrative in the second person is going to raise in the reader's mind, and it's never going to go away because you're constantly saying it that way, is who is saying this to you? Who is pointing this out? And if the narrative doesn't address that, the 2 times that I've used the second person to tell the story, I certainly never told anything at 650 pages long that way. The 2 times that I've done it, I made it clear gradually but surely who was actually pointing all these things out. And this book doesn't, to the best of my knowledge, do that. That's one of the things I'll clear up in a second read. But it's not, and it didn't strike me as nihilistic. It's got a great cast of characters, first of all, including the one of the 2 main female characters who is a remarkable creation. Almost hands down better than anybody else in the book. But even when the author is being sort of dodgy and feckless and, pub quizzy, he's still hitting on that note of contingency, of whether or not things are really there at all, what they happen like. Let's see if I can find this. There's a point where a character, or much earlier on in the book, a character says sometimes after he'd drunk a couple of beers, he'd come out with crazy ideas. For instance, if a dog's sense of smell was 50,000 times more powerful than a human's, that meant that instead of humans' binary perception of there and gone, dogs must have a spectrum of there-ness. Like, say you're here, then you go out. To me, you're gone. But to a dog, you're still mostly here, because your smell lingers much longer, and that's their strongest sense. So they must have a wholly different understanding of time, because for them, the past is literally still around. When a dog looks at the world, it must see all of these presences gradually fading out, like a sky full of jet contrails. Now, not only is that really good, as prose, but that fills this book. One thing knocking another thing out of course. I really liked it. I really enjoyed it. So it was it was a bit naughty of me to read it so far ahead of time, but I did, and I don't regret it. I'm going to read it again when I get the finished copy. And then the next book I read was, or another book that, oh God, there's no lighting here. This is Billy the Kid by Robert Utley. I found this trade paperback, as opposed to, I once had the hardcover of this eons ago. I looked it up online. It was exactly the thing that I remembered that came wrapped in plastic at bookstores. And I read this when I had the hardcover, and I really liked it. I really liked this author. But something happened in between when I read this book the first time and when I read it this weekend. And that something was Deadwood, the TV series Deadwood, which if you have not seen, you really should see and study. Because when people write books set in the Old West of America, male authors tend to adopt a kind of precious archaism that they view as maybe the way people talked or thought. You can see it, for instance, in Lonesome Dove, but it occurs everywhere. It's all over the place, and it verges into the silly romanticism, the singing cowboy, Gene Autry, that sort of thing. And even when you're writing nonfiction, this is a biography of Billy the Kid. Even when you're writing nonfiction, you're going to be tempted to do that because you're going to be soaking yourself in the period. And it's not false. The period did have a way of talking like that, if I'm making that clear at all. And what I noticed this time around in this book is, I should say, Deadwood happened between my first reading of this book and my second reading of this book. I don't know that Robert Utley was ever aware of Deadwood, but he was certainly aware of that archaic patois. And I noticed especially this time around how well he uses it, how well he shapes his book without ever pandering to that sort of thing. I loved it. Oh my, what a biography this is. There's a scene, I promise I won't read from every book, I promise, but there's a scene, one of the many killings by Billy Bonner, by Billy the Kid. One of the things that comes across in this book is what a loose cannon he was, in the quite literal sense of the term, from the age of the Nelsonian Navy, when a loose cannon had broken free of its casing and could roll around the deck. And these things weighed hundreds and hundreds of pounds. It could easily kill someone, but unaccountably. The true sense of loose cannon is not that you will break the rules in order to follow your own plan, which too often it's used as. Instead, the real meaning of the term is that you don't have a plan and you're a danger to everyone. That really comes across in this book. A couple of times in the book, turns out, I remember this from the first time, but I'd forgotten it, I guess, there's a copious record for Billy the Kid. And it's not all fake. Talk about playing into the mythology of the Old West. That was happening the minute Billy the Kid's body hit the floor in the boarding house room. The minute it hit the floor, the mythologizing started. And the man who killed him heavily contributed to that mythologizing, writing the cornerstone book of that mythology rather than fact. But even so, we have a copious record of people who weren't mythologizing. And over again in stories in this book, Utley recreates dialogue. That's perfectly okay with me. That is perfectly acceptable for you to do that. Who's the other person that does that? Alan Eckert does that all the time in his nonfiction work. In A Sorrow in Our Heart, for instance, his great biography of Tecumseh. He does that all throughout that book. But there's a real sense in a lot of those comments. A lot of people, drugstore owners, businessmen, passersby, will say to Billy the Kid, well, I'm not going to agree with what you're telling me to do. I know you could kill me, but I'm not going to agree to it. They always have that refrain. I know that you're just a force of anarchic violence. You could kill me just for wanting to, but I'm still not going to do it. Which really sort of raised Billy's in my estimation, because he doesn't just wantonly kill people, but he does in this scene. In this scene, Billy drifted over. They're in a bar. Billy drifted over to Grant, looking at Finnan's pistol, and observed, "That's a mighty nice-looking six-shooter you got." Casually lifting it out of Grant's holster, he takes the man's gun out of his own holster. Billy examined it admiringly and deftly spun the cylinder. Earlier, Finnan had fired several shots at a mark, leaving 3 of the chambers loaded with empty shell cases. When Billy handed the pistol back to Grant, the cylinder was positioned so that the hammer would fall on one of these cases rather than on a loaded round. Did Billy do that intentionally? Did he know? Grant grew louder and more menacing, smashing bottles on the back bar and vowing to shoot someone. Eyeing Jim Chisholm, he proclaimed his intention of killing John Chisholm. "Hold on," said Billy. "You got the wrong Sal by the ear." "This was John's brother Jim," he pointed out. "That's a lie," shouted Grant. Billy turned and walked towards the door. As Jim's son Will described it, quote, "Grant squared off at Billy, who when he heard the click of the gun, whirled round and bang, 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 right in the chin, could cover all of them with a $50. Isn't that awesome, that detail? Billy is that good a shot with no preparation of a moving target. The 3 shots in the chin are so close together that you could cover them with a silver dollar. "Joe," observed Billy, "I've been there too often for you." The shooting of Joe Grant earned Billy some notoriety, but like the dispatch of Windy Cahill, it was enough extenuating circumstances to prompt little concern in the Fort Sumner area. Had Billy perpetrated a cold-blooded murder, public opinion would have been aroused, and the sheriff of San Miguel County moved to investigate. That the newspapers gave the event virtually no notice, and that the law never acted, stamp it as simply another saloon dispute that ended fatally. And the thing is, the few newspapers that did give it coverage, Otley has seen them. He has scoured the record for them. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. So happy that I rescued it. Okay, then the next one that we have, I don't think I'm going to read you from this one. I don't think I have it over here. This is Celia Bell's historical novel, The Disenchantment, which it turns out is all about the affair of the Poisons, notorious incident in French history. But that's the backdrop, and it's really well done. I've only read one book on the affair of the Poisons, called The Affair of the Poisons, decades and decades ago. But this is really basically a love story that can't happen. It's a love story between 2 women that can't happen. At one point in the novel, one of the women, the main character, actually says, well, maybe, talk about contingencies and the path's not taken. She thinks, well, maybe we could just, move into a house and live together, as if women were allowed to do that. And for this character and her lover, that is unthinkable. It's the ultimate fantasy. It's as much as Star Trek to think about it. And that's going to happen. By halfway through this book, I knew that this author was too intelligent to just defy the historical record, to just invent something, which doesn't always happen, especially when the romance is gay in history. That doesn't always happen. I would say it more often than not does not. But in this case, the author, her style is... it's a little bit flat-footed, but it has an element that I didn't realize was sort of twining itself around me until I was, halfway through the book. And then after that, it was noticeable all the time, which is how compulsively this author sensualizes things. That is meant to be not only just an element, a very active element between her 2 main characters, these 2 women, but also in her whole world. The more the book goes on, the more sensual that world becomes, so that by the time you get to page 200, page 300, you can count on every random description having an undertone like that. And at first, when I was done, at one point, the author describes sunlight hitting a statue and working its way up the statue as the sun moves. And I read that and thought, all right, well, if you do too much of this, it's gonna be a little bit browbeating. But it never got that way at all. I thought instead that this was a remarkably controlled exercise in how to do this sort of thing. It didn't really grab me. I I thought it was a little bit too concerned with the affair of the poisons and a little bit too, well, like I said, Leadfoot. There are passages that are wonderfully insinuating, but there are other passages that just go on for page after page that are purely, what happens next. And I can't fault the author because there's genuine, a big intelligence here and a large talent. I don't know that I don't remember if this is the author's debut novel, but I've never read this author before, and I'm now going to. So good historical fiction. Maybe I would have liked it a lot more if it had been in a period that I really like. I think all the elements were there for that, but still, it kept me reading. I never wanted to stop. Then we have another book. This just got here. I could not resist reading it. This is by Philip Stern, and it's called Empire Incorporated. And it's a story of corporations that ruled the British Empire. And the author is wanting to push that forward, as opposed to having them be a sort of an also-ran in normal descriptions of the British Empire. The author wants to push that forward and say, they did a lot more than those histories tend to say. They covered a lot more ground. They made a lot more rules. And we should acknowledge that. We should acknowledge that what we think of as the empire was often private business. And that does shift the position. That does change the picture just a bit. And it's done really well. It's done in a professorial voice that is nevertheless not at all dry or pedantic. I really, really enjoyed it, especially since it's intricately connected with the history of my own country. Like at one point we have here, Edmund Burke shows up a lot in here, so does Samuel Johnson, a whole bunch of other characters, all the usual suspects, but wonderfully sifted here. So that by the time you're done with the book, you're not going to think of these people the same way again. And you're not going to think about things like the East India Company again, ever. If this book was meant to be a sort of a hurled gauntlet to complacency on that kind of a subject, it works. Absolutely. But we have I wanted to read you something here. Much like the American colonies, the East India Company had accumulated centuries of charters, independent government, and claims to property and rights at home and abroad that complicated any effort to regulate or subsume it. Government had no coherent policy on the issue, not least due to, as one historian put it, quote, a seemingly endless game of ministerial musical chairs. In the decade following the accession of George III in 1760, the 1/4 of the House members that were India stock owners dominated the India debates in the Commons. But this did not so much represent a company infiltration of Parliament as project a vicious ideological and partisan debates going on in the company over how to handle its expansion onto the floor of Parliament, and vice versa. It seems a little dodgy to me, and that happens just a few times throughout here. That definitely 100% represents an infiltration of the company into Parliament. I mean, how can you say that it doesn't represent that? But, I mean, if it reflects the squabbling that was going on in the boardrooms of the East India Company and moves those squabblings onto the floor of Parliament, fine, it's still an infiltration. But anyway, there was also no consistent position on the question of corporate charters. George Grenville, one of the great advocates for the imposition on the American colonies, impositions, really, that's the word we're going to use, defended the company's autonomy as a matter of, quote, public faith and private property. Autonomy from the government. Conversely, Thomas Walpole, who a decade later would doggedly pursue a charter for a joint stock company in the government in Ohio, insisted that an empire in India was, quote, too unwieldy to be governed by a company of merchants. Even Robert Clive, perceiving his employers to be too reticent to support its and his expanding power in Bengal, made the case for more aggressive state intervention. So large a sovereignty, he argued, may possibly be too extensive for a mercantile company. So you see, you've got government agencies arguing for corporations, and you've got corporation executives arguing for more government involvement. It's a muddy picture, and this author pays you, the reader, the compliment of not clearing it up. So I tremendously enjoyed it. It was a tremendously impressive experience. Let's keep going here. Okay, this next one is Don Bentley. This is The Forgotten War. This is a military thriller in which a former soldier in Afghanistan is just out and about in Austin, Texas, just enjoying himself with his buddies, with some of his former comrades in Afghanistan when they are surrounded by government police, and they take one of his comrades away. And a comrade disappears into the bowels of the military penal system, maybe never to be seen again. You certainly wonder about that in the course of the book, but the main character wants to know what on earth is going on here. and is being completely stonewalled by the government, of course, can't get any answers, figures, well, this has got to be connected with service in Afghanistan. And my friend was involved in some covert operations in Afghanistan, so what I will do is look up all the people who were connected with us in Afghanistan and see if I can piece together the story. And when he does that, gradually he realizes that a lot of the people connected with what they were doing in Afghanistan are turning up dead in suspicious circumstances. So his friend might be alive, but a lot of other people connected with something that went on back there aren't alive. And that's a terrific premise, but okay, it's a terrific premise, and people that like military style thrillers that will be enough for a lot of them, that it is a terrific premise. That is a terrific premise. And it's not incompetently written. It's written very much as an airport military thriller. This author never met a cliche that he doesn't like. You can see them coming a mile away. See what I did there? And none of the characters are anything more than what central casting will make them if this is ever adapted for the big screen. It's written in that register for that purpose. So I don't imagine there are many people who will go to a military thriller looking for more than that. You'll be in the wrong place if you do. That's typically not what these books provide. In the rules of military thrillers, this was really, really effective. It had no dull points, even though there are long, long stretches, especially in the middle half of the book, when I got the impression the author thought most people weren't paying attention anymore. They were maybe skipping those parts to get to the end. And there's a slam bang scene at the ending. It goes on for quite some time, and it's really well done. So maybe those readers are right. But there are long sections in the middle where the author chooses to beep, 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 back up his truck and dump his exposition. And even those things I thought were well done. It's just, I'm in the odd position here of recommending a book, even though it didn't work for me. I know this would work for you if you like that sort of thing, because it's well done. It's a well done example of that, but I think this sort of thing can be done more intelligently. I've seen it done more intelligently by other people who, this guy is part of the same machinery that has produced a few authors that I really like. The machinery where he is scripted by the Tom Clancy literary estate to write in Tom Clancy's world, either short books about Ops Center or the campus team or whatnot, or huge books, gigantic 1,000-page doorstoppers. That is a great way of finding an audience. It's a great way of testing out your narrative capabilities, and it is producing good authors. And it could here too. If this author, I think if he'd tried a little harder, well, a little harder not to be quite so predictable. And I mean, it isn't just the cliches and the lack of characters, and there's going to be a wild guy, there's going to be a tough guy, there's going to be a stoic guy. I kept waiting on every page for one of the characters to have a code name Reaper, because they always do. It wasn't just that, though. It was also predictable in terms of what got Frodo abducted by the military police, what got the main character taken into custody. I swear I wasn't a quarter of the way through this book before I guessed what that was, and I waited patiently for 200 pages, and I was right in almost every detail. I was right. You will be too. Maybe that also is not a debarment for this kind of book. Okay. This next one is I won't go into it in great length. I'm gonna do a video review of it for my other channel, for the channel I do with Sarah at the Bookish Knitter. We have a chatting category romance channel, but I did read a category romance, and that was Harlequin Historical, the Game of Courtship with the Earl. I've never read, who's this? Paulia Belgado? I've never read Paulia Belgado before. This is a historical romance set in the early days of the Victorian era. And it stars two characters who, they aren't particularly good at the romance thing. They really aren't. Our main character is a woman. She is the daughter of an American industrialist, and she is taller than average and more independent. And her father, bless him, did not care that she was a daughter instead of a son, so he made sure she was very familiar with the business world, with the world of Pittsburgh steelmaking, with all the stuff that ladies shouldn't care about. And so her seasons in London trying to find a husband are going disastrously. And as you can tell from the title, she cooks up a scheme with a Scottish earl, who is also a bit of an outcast, not least because he's huge. So there's an element here where the fact that she doesn't tower over him is important. It's not that big an element, but it is there. They concoct a scheme that, he's an earl. If he is seen to pursue her, then others will want to pursue her, and that might stand a chance of getting her a marriageable husband or whatnot. And you can guess already from the story that they come to love each other. But I have a lot more to say about this, but I want to say it over on that channel, which is still struggling for content, but I will fix that this weekend. Okay, then we have this thing, Eugene Vodolazkin. This is his sort of a sequel to his book Laurus. A lot of you will remember Laurus had a bright red cover. It had the same font as this. And it's a fictional kingdom that it's in all respects, except that the author would bridle and maybe not even know what I'm talking about. It's in all respects Ruritanian fiction, which we have seen on this channel in The Prisoner of Zenda and whatnot. Even the New Arabian Nights. It gets twee. It's one little bottle kingdom parable after another. And where that worked, I thought that worked in Laurus, and a lot of critics did too. Laurus got reviewed everywhere. It doesn't work if you just keep doing it. I don't think it works if you just keep doing it. This seemed very much a sequel to me, and also very much played out. All the aspects of that little kingdom, the little mythical kingdom, that struck me as so inventive, and even caustic commentary in the first book. Here, I was like, okay, all right, fine. But do you have a story to tell? Any characters? Do you have anything more to do than this? I wish this book had been rethought on the Launchpad. It was I think the biggest dud for me. Then we have this is Ursula Goodenough. I think we saw this on this channel. This is The Sacred Depths of Nature: How Life Has Emerged and Evolved. And it's a beautiful little thing from Oxford University Press. It's got tons of illustrations, cladistic charts, black and white photos artfully arranged. There are photos in here that are only in here for the beauty of what they show you. Okay, you get DNA, cytosine, and guanine, and all that sort of stuff. But you also get pictures that are just here to be pretty. They also tell a story, but they're here because they are evocative. And I'm not going to say much about this either because I'm reviewing it for the Martha's Vineyard Gazette. But I was worried about this, needless to say, because sacred is right there in the title. I was worried about this being one of the books that I read. Oh my God, I read probably 6 or 7 of them a week. They are not on this weekend report, even though they are part of my weekend reading. I'm not going to talk about these self-published pieces of bilgewater that I have to read and review every single day. I'm not, but a lot of them are, underneath the natural world, we all know there is a spirit with a capital S, and I don't care about your denomination, man. I just care that you bend the knee. And I have to sound the same note on those books over and over again, which is, A, there's absolutely no evidence for anything like that at all, no matter what, whether you're denominational or not. And B, you shouldn't need it at all. If you're looking at a 280-year-old tortoise that's still alive, still contentedly munching on grass, will still crane his neck for a little scratch. So there's still a person in there at 280 years old. That ought to be enough wonder for you. That really ought to be enough wonder for you. When you are laying there on the, freezing your tuchus off on the ground, looking up at the aurora borealis, and you can swear you hear it making noises. And it is always changing and just pushing your eyesight to the limit of what your brain can comprehend with how beautiful it is. That ought to be enough for you in terms of wonder, in terms of the sacred depth. But this author surprised me, very much surprised me. I loved this book. As small as it is, I loved it. So you might love it too. You'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot about abiogenesis, about genetics, about your own biology, about the biosphere of the world. You'll learn a lot as well. Okay, then we have this big thing. This was a reread. This is by Miranda Carter. This is George, Nicholas, and Wilhelm. I read this when it first came out, and I found it just recently and read it again this weekend, and really, really liked it. This is a really terrific book. A perfect combination of biography and broad-scale history. So if you're looking for that, if you're looking for something because that usually is impenetrable to you or repulses you, definitely pick this book up. Definitely, especially since these men weren't uh, empty figureheads. They really weren't. I mean, you could make that case with George, with King George V. You could make that case. I think you'd be wrong, but you could do it. The other two, and especially Wilhelm, you certainly could not make that case. And therefore, they were responsible for the world that ended on their watch. To a large extent, they were. And you live in the world that came out of the ashes of that. So you will. This might be more of a draw for you reading history and biography than, for instance, the Peloponnesian War. For instance, Miranda Carter has a perfect ear for how to balance broad-scale exposition with great little character moments. And I could be wrong about this, but I got the distinct impression the second time reading through this book that she had the same reaction that I did, or maybe she produced that reaction in me, which is that the narrative seems incredibly fascinated with Wilhelm, with Kaiser Wilhelm, the guy at the bottom there. You come to the inescapable conclusion that if he had been a little bit more loved, or maybe a little bit more physically whole, he had a withered arm. It was the nerves and the muscles were crushed when forceps were used to extract him from the birth, from womb. And that wasn't true of his cousins. And they were all cousins. That's why they all look the same. But when you're reading this book, not only are you fascinated by him, of course you are, because he's given to outlandish statements. He was a more or less self-evidently evil figure in a way that I would argue that Miranda Carter is aware that Tsar Nicholas was also evil, but that it isn't self-evident, and it's possible for you to draw a favorable impression of him, despite the fact that a Tsar can't be a favorable figure. But with Wilhelm, there's no way to avoid it. And that makes him fascinating. And I was all the more fascinated, not least because their world need not have been destroyed. If Wilhelm had been a different man, we would be looking at a completely different ensuing century, I think. But the Miranda Carter tries real hard to give equal emphasis to all three of these people. But unfortunately, maybe it's just unavoidable. Maybe it's not. Unfortunately, or fortunately, or whatever, they get more interesting the further down the list you go here. George was not interesting. Nicholas is interesting, and Wilhelm is fascinating. And that creates a kind of genetic imbalance in the book. I thought Miranda Carter did a great job of working on that, but even so, I think the book belongs to Wilhelm. At least this time around, I thought so. But when I first got it, I thought this time around, I thought, well, I'll reread it because I don't have the patience for libraries. Obviously, I don't, because I buy a book for $1 to reread it instead of borrowing it. The thing that kills me with libraries is waiting lists. I just don't want to be on a waiting list. I just don't. And I could solve that by simply going to the library in person and browsing in person. You're obviously not on a waiting list for a book you're holding in your hand. But I don't do that instead. But anyway, when I first got this copy for a reread, I thought I would get rid of it. Now I don't think I will. I think I will keep it. I think it's revisitable. Then this next one, this was also a find. This is by Ellen Moody. A lot of you have told me that she is still alive and kicking and still talking obsessively about Trollope. This is her book, Trollope on the Net, about early internet discussion board forums about Anthony Trollope. This book is her commentary, but also large transcripts from those discussion boards, and I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Oh my God, I wish there was a sequel. I wish I'd been around when I was around, but I wish I'd known those discussion boards were there. I don't think I probably even had a computer when all this discussion was happening. And probably discussions like this are happening somewhere online. So I don't know where I would even look. Maybe the literature threads on Reddit, God help me. But this was just great. And I remember wondering, were those discussion threads, 30 years ago, were they choked with academics who had granddaughters had just taught them how to use the internet and thought they could just pontificate? But I got almost none of that in this book. Instead, it was just endless, extremely spirited Trollope commentary. It was just what I wanted. And then another old book that I found. This is by Jay Satterfield, not to be confused with Paul Satterfield, who gave, let's just say, an arresting performance in the movie Arena. But Jay Satterfield, I found this just the other day. This is The World's Best Books, which is a history of the modern library, which I have a whole bunch of modern library editions here, and I'm always interested in them, no matter what I see, even if I don't want it. I'm always interested in looking through it and seeing what they did. And this was a project to put a wide array of great books at the fingertips of the public for a nominal price. And I didn't realize until I read this book how much of an ideological polar opposite it was supposed to be to prescriptive things like the Great Books program, which also put popular, relatively affordable editions of great books at the fingertips of the public, but told the public what to read and in what order and how. Whereas the modern library took the exact opposite approach. We'll make a wide array of these things. We'll make them cheaply. We'll mass produce them. And then you can pick what you want and don't want. We'll give them good introductions in some cases. We'll give them good cover artwork in some cases. And we will make up the cost of subsidizing the cover artist, of paying the cover artist by bulk. We'll pay the cover artist once, but we'll reprint the cover art a million times. I didn't know a lot of the details about this, even though I am fairly well up on Bennett Cerf's life. I was not aware of the details of a lot of what was in here. So there was a learning element, but I also loved it. The author did exactly what I was hoping he would do, which is to take the story of the modern library and broaden it to tell a broader story about American literacy in the early and mid 20th century, taking you all the way to the end of the 20th century, because this book goes all the way to the famous best novels and best nonfiction of the 20th century, those lists that Modern Library did. That when was that? Was that 30 years ago? Maybe even more than that. But those lists dominated discussions everywhere. Everybody wanted to know. Nobody really paid attention to the nonfiction, but everybody paid attention to the best fiction of the 20th century list. Not only because everybody was immediately sure that Rudyard Kipling's Kim had not been written in the 20th century, but also because that list caught almost everybody by surprise, because they were checking off all kinds of names. Then I got to Zuleika Dobson and thought, what? What? I've never read that. There was a run on Zuleika Dobson because of that list. But this book goes all the way to there. So it's not just ye olden days. I love histories of the publishing industry anyway, histories of books and books about books anyway, but I love this. I'm so happy that I found it. This was just terrific. And there you go. That is a weekend update. It's not complete because I'm leaving out some rereads, and I'm definitely leaving out what I sometimes scathingly refer to as workbooks. Although I like to think all books are workbooks. There were some self-published things that I read and reviewed that I would not want to talk about. And it wouldn't be fair anyway, since in the case of Publishers Weekly or Kirkus Reviews, my review is anonymous. So it wouldn't be fair for me to talk about the book when the whole strength of the review in cases like that, the whole strength of them being anonymous is that they are speaking for the journal, rather than anyone saying, well, it was just that one person who thought so. No, it's Publishers Weekly that thinks so. So I want to preserve that. So I'm not talking about them. But this was a good weekend for reading. And I just thought, I don't think I've ever done a video like this. So I thought I would try this out and see. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. This has gone on quite long enough. All my videos go on long. Why do you people put up with me? Anyway, I will wrap this up, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.